So like we have no shortage of data and risks, right? So it's really how do we bring those all together to make sure we're working on the most important things. I kind of always emphasize like, hey, our job at the end of the day is really to, as security teams and professionals, and even like as PlexTrac, like, hey, are we helping people identify the most important things they should be working on right now? Are we helping them show that they're actually making progress?
So joining us today, old friend and fellow cybersecurity dweeb, Dan. Like I mean that in the most endearing way. So
Yeah.
yeah, so Dan DeCloss, founder, chief customer and brand officer over at PlexTrac. Super excited to have you on, man. Thanks a lot for joining the show today. I know we've had like a bunch of great chats over the years, so hopefully we keep our momentum.
Yeah, you bet. No, thanks for having me. Excited to be here. And yeah, as always, enjoy talking things, everything related to security and continuous threat exposure management and all that jazz. So it's fun. I appreciate being on. So
Yeah, so maybe without further ado, let's dive right in. Um, the team has, of course, as they always do, came up with a like season appropriate meme for this episode. So for those of you who took the poll on the way in, that'll explain the why and the how behind your choices. But Dan, like before we get into that, why don't you talk us through like the concept? I'd say like what you do for a living, kind of high level, and in particular, like wanted to kind of dig in on the concept of exposure management, which I think is like this phrase that's getting kicked around and has been for a while, like as kind of like the evolution of maybe a few different things that I'll let you get into, but like really just feels like it's front and center now. It's like the thing we're now telling people, which is like just manage your exposures. And I feel like that means everything and nothing. So like maybe just start there and just kind of frame like how you think about the term and the problem and like how you all are approaching it.
yeah. No, thanks. I would say it starts with kind of my background. My background is in penetration testing and identifying, severe gaps and weaknesses that actually can lead to breaches, right? And I've been on the proactive side, of the house where it's like, hey, I want to try and help people identify those issues that really will lead to a breach, right? And I think at the end of the day, we all as security professionals really need to kind of keep in mind like those are the most important things to be focused on is like, hey, what does lead to a breach? What leads to compromise? What leads to us having those deep exposures, right? And so I think the term exposure management has kind of blossomed out of the traditional vulnerability management with the more proactive side of the house, right? So, because I would say, vulnerability management in its history has been considered a more of a proactive exercise. You are trying to identify those activities, but I would say probably even now, probably my hunch, I'd be curious your opinion, probably for the last 5 years plus now, vulnerability management, like the time to exploit is so small that it's not really a proactive exercise anymore, right? So how do we actually get a handle on, hey, we've got all of these issues that we have no challenge in identifying the issues, but like how do we actually prioritize the right ones? And so that's always been my passion, right? And that's my background is like, hey, prioritizing the right ones. I've always felt like, hey, pen testing is going to identify a lot of those key issues, right? So what we do, where we started with PlexTrac was like helping automate as much of the engagement lifecycle as possible. I had some pain around reporting, but really the mission was always to help bring those pen test results front and center alongside all of the other vulnerabilities and sources of risks. And that's why I think the term exposures has really come into play is that you can have vulnerability scans, you can have detections from different canaries or like honeypots, or you can have risk assessments, you can have all different kinds of things that are going to identify risks. And so really the exposure management capability is to actually bring those all together. How do we actually prioritize the most important ones to fix right now? And then what I always say is like, and then that's kind of half the battle, right? I mean, it's a big part of the battle, but at the end of the day, someone has to get that work done. Like they have to go fix it. You have to be able to validate that the fix is work. And ideally, you're testing for recurrence. Like, hey, is this not coming back, right? So that's, I mean, that's the long the long answer to like why, why I'm passionate about this, and how we're helping with that, that PlexTrac, we'll probably, probably get into, but we help isolate, one, we help consolidate all the findings across those different sources of risk and provide, risk scoring capabilities in the context of your business, and then be able to help on the mobilization front for tracking and remediation, and helping automate as much of that process as possible. But that's what I'm passionate about, and that's why I'm here talking about it. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that feels like, you kind of did a great job just kind of teeing up like why we're here. And even as you and I were just like catching up for no particular reason, like wanted to talk through this. And even, kind of looking at the poll results here, it's like, where most folks are is like feeling like they have the pieces in place, like the foundational pieces, and then figuring out how do you operationalize that, right? And I
Yeah.
think that huge jump that you were describing, which is from like traditional vuln management, which is like we know where all the problems are. Yeah,
Right.
that's not super
Yeah.
hard to figure out. But yeah, like the overlay on top of that, which I think used to only come very periodically from actually testing, right? And having context behind like, is this thing actually reachable? Are there other mitigations in place that mean we can deprioritize it? And like the stuff that you just don't get from like a CVSS score and stuff like that, right? So
Right.
um, I
You
think
know,
that's the interesting aspect of it.
yeah, exactly. And I think those poll results are also interesting because like that, I would say probably a lot, like that's probably reflective of probably a lot of people, in that like, hey, we got all the tools and things, all the pieces should kind of be there, but that process, that people, and that, I think this is always the challenge within the defender side of the house, is that attackers have like all the resources in the world, they have all the time, those kinds of things, but defenders have limited resources, and they're having to deal with corporate culture, right? And all the other aspects that go into their processes. How do you master, getting through that, as well as actually focusing on the right things, I think is a big part of the operationalization of exposure management, right? So.
Yeah, like that asymmetry is tough, right? It's just,
Right.
obviously like, unfortunately that stuff kind of gets like the downsides of having vulnerabilities will kind of get imposed on you, and like you don't always get a say in that. But I think, we kind of talked to, you know, just breaking down like those pillars of exposure management. And it is like it feels like the key parts here. It's just like what's really critical. Let's make sure we knock out the stuff, make sure we can figure out and agree on what's critical first.
Yeah.
Um, and then I think kind of like the way that you described it here, which is just, being continuous, I think. And I think that word like operational keeps coming up, but it's like
Right.
that feels like kind of the big shift that's taking place, where like, at least to me as like an outsider to being a vuln management professional, I just kind of watched it from afar, but like felt like change management, which is
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
okay, maybe we should patch this thing. And then everyone gets to come up with a list of reasons why you shouldn't. And then if you navigate that process, then you get to patch it. And it's
Yeah.
like, that it feels like is the shift, which is like,
Right.
obviously we can't do that anymore. Like we need to figure out just a fundamentally different model.
Yeah. 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 Exactly. And while exposure management, well, pen testing is like an input into exposure management. The aspect around continuous is something that I've always been passionate about in the pen testing space, right? Because there was an era, this was probably 10 years ago or more, where everyone's like, oh, pen testing is going to go away, because like there was this kind of assumption that, hey, the automated technologies are catching up to the pen testing space, and I never bought into that. I was like, no, I think there's always going to be a need, because attackers are always going to be attackers. Like, and so, and really where I predicted it would go, and it kind of has gone, is that like, no, it's like you need to be doing pen testing more often and in more succinct ways. That are more custom, and truly more of like what we used to call kind of a purple teaming approach, but that's that continuous mindset of like, hey, I'm not going to go spend 6 months I'm not going to use all my resources on pen testing in like a 6 month engagement. That's still well and good, but it's more, hey, do we do this in like 2 week sprints where we focus on specific tactics and techniques that we know attackers can, or we think that attackers can get in, And that philosophy truly, we've seen it really improves the overall security posture of an organization
Yeah.
at a much faster rate, right? So
Yeah. And it is, like as kind of looking at this, like just always looking for like similarities between how we treat things like detection and response, right? And like how that shifted. And it's like, yeah, I hear like what you're describing, like, pen testing or red teaming or whatever type of exercise you want to frame it as is like the core concept there, I think, is the same as like incident management, which is like
right.
the most important, not most important, but like the really critical work that needs to get done is like when the engagement or when the incident's over and figuring out like how do we make sure we don't, what you said early on, like how do we make sure like we're avoiding repeat root causes, like attackers aren't finding the same paths in, and it's kind of that continuous improvement.
Yeah.
And it just, it's interesting is like, I hear you talk about that and it's like incident management in general, not just in cybersecurity, like that's been such a foundational thing. And that's a discipline that's been, honed over,
Right.
decades, many decades or longer. And slowly we're learning those lessons, and it feels like slowly on like the testing and exposure management and vuln management side, now we're like slowly learning the lessons from incident response and incident management, right? So it's
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And that's why I think like the overall strategic approach, makes sense as what is becoming known as exposure management, which is a great, kind of lead in here of like being able, we have no shortage of data sources, for risks, on both the proactive and the reactive side, right? I mean, incident management teams are going to be getting alerts all day long, right? Vuln scanning happens on a continuous basis. And now pen testing is happening on a continuous basis, and we have like more automated pen testing tools that help with those managed service kind of concepts. So like we have no shortage of data and risks, right? So it's really how do we bring those all together to make sure we're working on the most important things. I kind of always emphasize like, hey, our job at the end of the day is really to, as security teams and professionals, and even like as PlexTrac, like, hey, are we helping people identify the most important things they should be working on right now? Are we helping them show that they're actually making progress, right? Because I think that's the other kind of unspoken challenge a lot is like, hey, we feel like we've got all these things in place, but how do we actually show that we're actually getting better? And is it in the context of our business, right? Because, a vulnerability scan or a pen test, let's take vulnerability scanning, for example, like it could highlight a CVSS score on two different machines of like a 9.8, a critical, right? But that doesn't, it lacks the context of that environment, right? So being able to consolidate that, which then applies that, you can apply your own business context to the prioritization capability to really say like, okay, well, that CVSS 9.8 on that lab machine, it's not as critical of an asset, right? Like, hey, but like this other one is like a web exposed DMZ, if internet facing asset. Like, if you're going to have to pick between those two, that one's pretty obvious, but at scale, you need to be able to automate that kind of decision making, right? And that's where if you have all the data in one source, you can make much easier and quicker decisions around that. And then like we come back to the most important part is actually mobilizing the troops, right? So being able to actually say like, hey, who's working on this? When will it get done? What's its current state? Has it been like once it gets fixed, has it been validated? And then how are we actually testing for recurrence, right? So
and maybe like thinking about where really kind of getting over that hump in the last stage is interesting. So like I just ask a question about that, just not even product specific, but for orgs that have kind of cracked the nut on that and figured out how to do it, right? It's like, because it is like that last mile is super hard, and by
right,
definition it's organization specific. So like
right,
buying better tools and better context, like better tech can take you from vuln management to exposure management and a kind of more holistic view of like risks and all these different inputs. um, but at the end of the day, like you just like flipping that switch, and for a lot of organizations it really is like a fundamental like process and mindset shift to
right.
like proactively managing risk and
Yeah.
just kind of like not approaching it like change management and why shouldn't I, right? And that curious, like 30 seconds or less, like what do if you're like, what are the orgs who have made that shift? Like, what's the commonality between them that you've seen? Is it like teams? Is it personalities, leadership? Like, what is it?
Yeah, and that's why I kind of highlighted those poll results because to me, probably the most important thing to get right first is the cultural mindset shift, right? Of like, hey, we are going to be more we're going to be working our way towards being in a more proactive state than a reactive state, and that's something that I think a lot of people preached strategy for a long time around. You need to be more proactive, you need to be more proactive, but like in practice, what does that look like? And that's like, so I kind of use the example like when I was a security director. We did just kind of start, you eat an elephant one bite at a time, right? So like we just started like, okay, let's take MITRE ATT&CK, right? And we sat down for like a couple hours and we just said like, hey, based on what we know of our organization, we think we probably have gaps, in these areas. So let's go test for those first, right? So that was just a spot check. That was a gut check. There was no, formula to that. That was just us knowing our organization and knowing our security controls. It's
But
like,
it's
hey,
like it's an informed hypothesis, though,
right.
right? Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, but there was no AI, or there's but of course this is 10 years ago now. But then what we started doing is like, okay, now we're testing these TTPs and we treated it like a sprint, right? So that was what worked for us. I mean, other organizations may do it differently, but I think it's getting into the mindset that we're doing these things in a more proactive state so that the reactionary stuff becomes less less verbose, so to speak. I don't know if that's the right term, but like, where it's like, on the reactionary side, the things that really do come in are really the things that matter, right? As opposed to just as much noise as possible, where you still kind of get sucked into that garbage drain of like, these are not real incidents, these are not real events. How do we start eliminating these things? That kind of a mindset. So I think first and foremost, it's been a cultural mindset shift has been the most important aspect. And then being able to have a mechanism to consolidate across your different sources, have a way to apply the context in your risk scoring capabilities or whatnot. And then obviously dealing with the culture around the mobilization pieces too, right? So um, every security program is probably going to be dealing with, people that are assigned to fixing the issues are not necessarily the people assigned to finding them. So,
Yeah.
or tracking them. So, the security team is the ones like, hey, you got to go fix this. You got to go fix this. So that's a cultural element as well, right? So,
Yeah, appreciate that. Yeah, that is and again, just like I think just kind of the theme there, it's just like doing that stuff continuously. And I think even, we've kind of talked about like, internally when we kind of talk to folks about even like atomic red team and stuff like that. It's
yeah,
just like
yeah,
because that's the most common question I think with any of the honestly, I feel like any topic like this in cybersecurity is like, where's the best place to get started with a new activity or a new way of doing things? And a lot of it is just like doing small things, but doing them very regularly. And then like
mhm,
just think of like taking your vitamins, right?
yeah.
Like not running, like not participating in a triathlon or trying to run a marathon. For you just joining us, there's like an infographic we're missing, which is like the age at which Dan and I could do like really
Yeah,
physical activity, the first generation of cybersecurity controls.
yeah,
And there's like a continuum there, but
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a good
I digress. So
one.
um, so we can't have an episode without talking about AI. And I was like, I do want to talk about this because I think this was, I think, kind of the genesis of like, when we were just kind of chatting casually, it's like, this is where we see all of the pressure.
Right.
And, if you think about exposure management, like a massive, like a critical input into that is like the vulnerabilities that, you have in your attack surface, right? And
Right.
so that one input we know is getting a tremendous amount of pressure. And then we read about the more operational aspects of intrusions, meaning, like AI models and agents being able to do like finding a vulnerability and maybe exploiting it, like, that's kind of a big deal. But like at the end of the day, there's a lot more that goes into an actual successful intrusion or a breach, right? And a lot of that's operational, but like finding those attack paths, we're starting like we now like we there's prior art there. We know that's possible. And so we kind of think about like where pressure is being put on the system, which is like exploitability and kind of that life cycle, right? And then what it means for like defenders and trying to really break this down. So like,
Right.
you kind of had these like few things here, and I think we've already hit on, the concept of CTEM in general, which is like the exposure management buzzword, but the really critical operator there, which is like doing this all the time.
Yeah.
Um, and then like pushing down into like more kind of like predictive modeling, being more intelligent, like how you bubble things up and down. Like what's kind of what's the talk track on top of like the defensive operation shift there?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think like everybody would say, oh, well, we got to fight AI with AI, which is absolutely true, right? But my premise is that it's going to take longer for AI to proliferate effectively across the defensive environments, as it is in already the attacker side of the house, right? So because we're already seeing it, AI is helping find, identify 0 days like at a lot much faster rate. But at the end of the day, that just kind of adds to the pile of all the other vulnerabilities that a team already has in their backlog, right? So it really is like, okay, as we continue to progress on the defensive side, we do want to keep focusing on AI being able to help in the prioritization of those aspects, and maybe eventually in the actual like automated remediation piece. But I think like we live in a world where yeah, I mean, most CISOs are gonna still have a lot of caution around any kind of automated patching and remediation,
Yeah,
story, right? So I think that's
we're not there yet.
yeah, I mean, it's going to be a while. So really what that means is like, how do we automate as much of that life cycle with a human still in the loop? And how do we actually get better prioritization and risk contextualization in the context of the business? And that's where AI can really help. And like, you could even train your own models on your own data to help with that. But truly helping automate as much of that life cycle as possible um, so that you're kind of eating into that backlog a lot faster, right?
How have so we got call it 5 minutes left, right? And I want to spend some time kind of breaking down just like that defensive strategy a little bit
Yeah.
more, like kind of go to the next level of that.
Yeah.
But before we do that, like uh I don't know, you hear things like predictive analysis and risk scoring, and if you work at a giant bank, you've got models like FAIR, which take data from all over creation internally and externally and try to do risk modeling and scoring and prioritization. That is not the reality for 99.9% of anyone. Like,
Right.
um, even other really mature companies, like doing risk scoring with all the context you have to factor in is tough. Like, so when you think like, where have you seen like, whether it's like, traditional machine learning or, using LLMs or new tools, um, like what are the handful of data sources that you like if someone just wants to try doing this on their own without like buying anything other than just like the models they've got, right? If you've got
Mhm.
OpenAI or if you've got it like Anthropic, um, like what's your suggestion for how to like DIY some of that where it's like, hey, cool, look, like what are the obvious things you could put up there, call it, vuln data, attack surface information, some context, and then like what's the next things you like, what else do you feed in that like yields some results?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think like like if we were trying to talk about kind of how do we keep adding data sources to help models understand context, I think that I mean, MITRE ATT&CK is a great place. MITRE Defend. I mean, like as much resources that MITRE provides is a great place to start. Atomic Red Team is another great place to start. Of just like, hey, these are known knowns, right? So the model really does understand like, okay, these are the things that exist in the world today like let's forget about anything that we possibly don't know, right? And so things like, CISA kevs as well, right? So like, I mean, I think the CVE world is in a little bit of flux, right? Because everybody's just submitting so many. NIST has already come down and said like, hey, we're only gonna enrich the ones that we have known exploits for. So you can't rely on CVE risk scoring at all anymore. I mean, with the ones that are enriched by NIST, are going to be more valuable. But in general, I think like starting with some of those well-known data sources, and then some threat intelligence that might be related to your industries and your business, right? So that's where I kind of start from like data sourcing. If you're just trying to start in terms of just risk scoring in general, like what we've seen, and you're right, there are people that can get really, really complex, but I would say, those are the outliers. Everyone else is like probably not even trying, like they don't even have a place to start, right? And so we're like, and that is, the shameless plug, like what we built into PlexTrac for risk scoring is like you have this at your fingertips to be able to manipulate, and you can manipulate it over time to really hone in how scoring works in your environment. What are the key factors that you care about most? And this is just how I would advise anybody, even if you're not using our product. It's like, hey, what are the key elements that like I kind of gave a good example, like, hey, this asset lives in a data center or in a lab machine, whereas this asset is exposed to the internet. That's basic criteria, but like you start your risk scoring in a similar way to continuous testing of like, hey, if it's an iterative approach, we're going to keep going on it. That I know I'm starting to run out of time, but that's kind of like
No, you're good. I mean, I think the one thing you said that I want to like really key in on is like when you look at vuln data in particular, starting with CISA, like, yeah, so like let's forget about all the theoretical, maybe it could be exploited in the future. Like, I mean, you look at the stuff that's on the Kev list, which usually makes it there once it's been like fully weaponized, automated. It's part of like adversary platforms that they can buy like SaaS software, right? And so like, um, and the average age of those things is often like years. Like it is not, these are not 0 days that like
right.
somebody figured out how to exploit yesterday and now they're weaponizing them today. Um, so I mean, if nothing else, even just that advice, which is like just
Yeah.
start. I mean, you were talking about known knowns, like that is like the middle of the Venn diagram of like maybe it's bad and we have like operational proof that it could hurt you tomorrow.
Right, right.
Right.
And
So
that's why, I mean, I know obviously with Atomic Red Team, you guys are huge fans of MITRE ATT&CK. And like that's why I've been a huge fan of it too, is like, hey, this is how attackers are operating. Like you should try to be able to detect and even test for this type of activity, right? So
yeah, 100%, man. So and I think we've already covered a little bit of this, but like I do want to put a fine point on like what you do about this stuff, right? We got like a minute or so left, and I think I think we've talked through like those kind of reactive and the proactive like aspects of it a good bit, which is
yeah,
like treating it like we treat incident response, learn those lessons. However, like doing it in an always on fashion, right? So like unlike a giant big bang red team engagement or unlike a major incident that you post mortem, like create teeny tiny little incidents and create teeny tiny little problems and do it on an ongoing basis. And just like the continuous improvement aspect of that, like feels like that's huge. Um, and then we kind of have those pillars of like blast radius containment, right? Which is
right.
like, I think these last two are kind of definitely getting much more into like the security operations aspect of it. But
Sure.
that concept of designing networks that function more like a cell phone system than
Right.
like a campus LAN or a university or something like that, right?
Yeah,
There's
yeah,
no reason, like there's just no reason for workstations to talk to each other, and there's almost like there's very few reasons now for them to talk to like server infrastructure and
yeah,
things like that. So, um, you know, just doing a little bit or a lot up front to just
yeah,
limit the blast radius when these things happen is
yeah.
super critical.
And this is a tangential comment, but like on that zero trust principle, you know, treat AI in the same fashion. Like
Yeah.
AI itself, is a threat vector. Is a gold mine if you're not careful. Like if once an attacker gets into the environment, they'll definitely use your current AI systems to be able to glean more data. So like, the zero trust on internal AI or rogue AI, so to speak, is important. Right?
Yeah. Totally. Yeah, I agree. And I think it's, we're just learning how to, I think, kind of threat model and risk model
Right.
those systems. They're moving fast, but I think like a lot of those same principles, right? Which is like, they are still at the end of the day, like they are traditional computing systems, predominantly Linux. Like they're using identity. They're just happen to be maybe using a lot of them. And obviously, like, the speed is concerning, but like, you know, most of those like key pillars of the technology and most of the defensive principles are
Yeah.
largely unchanged. So that's like that's good to keep in mind. Awesome. Well, hey, man, we went right up to it. Dan, thank you so much, dude. This was a
Yeah.
fun conversation. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time and your insights and expertise.
I loved it. Yeah. Thanks for having me. Always enjoy, chatting with you, Keith, and thanks for having me on. And yeah, I look forward to hearing more about all things SecOps Weekly.
Awesome, man. Cheers. Cool. Talk to you again soon. Thanks everybody for being here. See you next week.
Thanks.